Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street is a progressive campaign agency that specialises in campaigning and community organising. We work with non-profit and community-based organisations, trade unions, progressive businesses and social democratic parties across the globe. Dunn Street develops community engagement and organising strategies to win campaigns both big and small, and we train engagement staff, volunteers and organisers in leadership and power building. And if you want to create change in your community, then hit us up at Dunn Street. Hit us up at dunstreet.com.au. How did I get that wrong? I've read that over 200 times. Today's episode is also brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. When you need the support with a legal issue, it can feel rather daunting. That's why for over 100 years, Maurice Blackburn has been helping guide clients with their legal needs. They're here to help you when you need them the most, from workplace to medical injuries, class actions, occupational diseases, and wills and estates planning. As Australia's leading plaintiff law firm, they have the local knowledge and the national network with the experience that you can count on. To find out more, simply visit mauriceblackburn.com.au. And finally, today's episode is brought to you by SwiftFox. Every moment on a campaign matters. You need the tools that you can trust. Lists that are up to date, phone banks that can change minds, emails that drive donations, events that will energise the community both online and offline, and text blasts that distill your message perfectly. SwiftFox CRM is made for campaigners by campaigners. And to find out more, simply go to swiftfoxcrm.com to win your next campaign. Hello and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left politics and organising podcast that drops every Friday and dives into the progressive campaign issues of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. And on today's episode, we're going to be talking to Ben Hart about climate communication and the media, and how the environmental movement, more specifically those engaged in climate change, are struggling to communicate to their audiences the need to act and address the issues that are affecting our planet. And Ben's going to talk about some of his experiences and the work that he does in this space. So looking forward to that conversation with Ben today. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify and Stitcher. And if you're done listening to the show, please leave us 5 stars on Apple Podcast. And don't forget to give us a review. And for all the latest updates, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn and YouTube. And also just a reminder that Socially Democratic is going to be at the Labor Fringe. The ALP National Conference is in Brisbane later this month, and we're going to be doing 2 live shows as part of the Fringe program, one on the Thursday afternoon and one on the Friday afternoon, one focusing on the trade union movement, where we've been and where we're going, and one focusing on campaigning. Electoral campaigning, what we've worked out we're doing quite well, and where we need to continue to grow and improve how we campaign into the future. So we're doing that in front of an audience, and we'd love for you to join us for those 2 podcast recordings. And to do so, you need to sign up and get your ticket through the Fringe. And I don't know the name of the link because I didn't write it in my show notes, but the links will be in the notes of today's episode. So please click on that link and register your ticket to come to the Fringe in Brisbane for the ALP National Conference. And the ALP National Conference runs from Thursday the 17th of August to Saturday the 19th of August. Actually, in addition to the 2 Socially Democratic podcasts, I'm also running, as part of Dunn Street, I'm running a workshop on community organising, and we're talking about a bit of a test case that we a campaign that Dunn Street ran successfully over the last 2 years, where we organised a community for change. So please also come to that. That's at 10 a.m. on Saturday, the 19th of August. All right, let's get to today's episode. We're taping this one on a Wednesday morning on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. And joining me actually in the Dunn Street studios, this is a rarity, is a bloke who's been working in environmental media and communication since 97, which is probably a lifetime ago, first as a journalist and then in various environmental roles with the Brumby governments here in the great state of Victoria. and has more recently led communications for the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, and he's the founder of Fireside Agency as he continues to work in the climate space with clients like Climate Works Centre, the Clean Energy Finance Corporation and Oxfam Australia. And he's joining us on the podcast today to talk about climate environmentalism. Ben Hart, welcome to Socially Democratic.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be where the magic happens.
Literally. Not the first time that you and I have spoken, though. This is a quid pro quo here. I've been on your podcast quite a while ago now, I think.
Yeah. I think
was it before or after COVID?
I think it might have been during COVID. No, we couldn't have done it during COVID because we wouldn't have been sat across from each other. I think it was before.
Wow.
Yeah. You were on the first season, one of our first people.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the podcast is Storycraft, about the art and science of storytelling. One of our best episodes was the Stephen Donnelly episode. Yeah.
Pages say that. Well, now you're in the other chair today, so I'm asking you the questions. And obviously, we're going to talk about environmentalism from a comms standpoint, and particularly about when we sort of start to talk about ways that we can overcome the challenges that the environmental movement has faced in convincing folks out there that climate change is real. Story plays an important role in that, but we'll talk about that a bit later. Before we do that, I want to know about your story. How did you come to be interested in this line of work?
Yeah, so my background is in journalism, and actually my first ever job was for an environmental standards newsletter straight out of uni. So that was kind of 97, first job out of uni. And that was really at a time when, there was lots of stuff going on around climate, and it was still called the greenhouse gas debate back then. And in some ways, lots of things have changed, but in some ways, things have stayed depressingly the same. But after that, I for my sins, I started working for the Herald Sun, and that was where I did kind of my training, and that really has, putting aside the shame of working for Rupert Murdoch, it actually was a really good place to learn about storytelling and really concise storytelling as well. Like I always say to people, tabloid newspapers, in terms of boiling down a story into its sort of essence in a way that's impactful, it was hugely beneficial to me in my career. I only lasted there for a couple of years before moving into work as a media advisor in the Bracks government at the time, and that was when I worked for Cheryl Garbutt, who was the Environment Minister at the time. And back then, it was much more about trees. So there was a lot of policy change going on around ending logging in the Otways, significantly reducing the number of timber mills in the country as well. So really started to get interested in, those kind of debates and seeing things firsthand, how those debates played out, and probably coming from quite a green background politically from my family, really getting a more exposure into the nuances of the climate debate, and perhaps the way in which class and, poverty and social structures intersect with the environment movement and environmental debates. So seeing how, those kind of logging decisions, which I think were the right things to do, still had significant impact on logging communities in certain areas of the state as well, and perhaps the ways in which the environment movement didn't think about things in an intersectional way in terms of how those things connect with each other. And so after that, became the Chief of Staff to Gavin Jennings, who was the Environment and Climate Change Minister at the time. So really getting into the policy, and really when climate stuff was really starting to kind of take hold in the government, and there was a lot of interesting things going on there as well. Sort of moving from that, the tree-based kind of issues into climate as well. And so following that, have had a variety of roles, but sort of most notably as the head of comms for the Australian Renewable Energy Agency. So really being, right at the centre of the climate wars, under, a Abbott government as well that was trying to, knock over ARENA at the time as well. So being part of the government, but also trying to defend the space there, and, coming pretty close to them knocking over ARENA a couple of times while I was there. But, really sort of coming out of that with some, real conviction about the need to properly communicate climate, the need to act on climate and do it in a way that connects with different audiences as well. And so when I started Fireside in 2018, really decided in a very intentional way to make a big part of it, trying to help people operating in the climate space more effectively, communicate with the people they needed to reach and needed to shift as well. And so, as you mentioned, we've done work for Climate Work Centre, we've done work for ARENA and CEFC and Oxfam, really trying to, help shift the needle for clients like that in a whole range of areas, but, primarily how to, speak to people about a climate that perhaps avoids some of the pitfalls that have occurred in the past about, disconnection in the way that we communicate these kind of things. Yeah.
In that time that you just described, was there a moment or moments where you thought to yourself, this particular subject matter is where I want to invest my skills and resources in a long-term capacity? Like, setting up your own business at Fireside, not an easy thing to do. Comes with a lot of challenges, as we all know, us in this world. But to say, well, here's actually where I want to specialise in. When was there moments in the past where you said, okay, I need to make a contribution here because this is super important?
Yeah, I think you've started your own business as well, and there's when you're hanging your shingle out, you're thinking about, what's your purpose here, and one of the reasons why you do your own thing is to really have the agency and control to really drill down on exactly the kind of work you want to do. And I've always chosen jobs where that kind of sense of purpose has been important, but when you're doing it for someone else, you're always at the whim of that organisation and the politics and the personalities and that kind of thing. So I think, when you think about what is the way that I can best use my experience and talents to really make a difference, and that's important to me. The obvious point is this area, because we're dealing with a potentially existential threat to the planet, and I've even toyed with the idea of, when we choose clients, of having a climate test on clients to say, if you're not shifting the needle on this stuff, then we won't work for you. Now, that's probably, when you're starting out, it's maybe a little bit too restrictive. Like, we do only work with progressive organisations that are making a difference, but having that kind of lens maybe is not what we're ready for yet. But I'd like to get to the point where it is the majority of stuff that we do, because it's when we all shuffle off, we want to know that we didn't just kind of sell air conditioners and just kind of treaded water. We actually did shift things, and so I feel like there is a lot of space to improve the way that we communicate about climate, which is what we're going to be talking about today as well. So I just see all the time sort of fundamental mistakes being made about how people talk about this kind of stuff. Yeah. And I feel like, with my background and mix of skills, then I'm not going to be the person that makes the whole difference, but can be a positive voice in talking about more connecting communications and more storytelling-led communications around climate.
Well, we've certainly seen over this northern European summer, temperatures, out of control in North America, all of these bushfires or wildfires, as they call them in the States, in Canada, and just intense heat in parts of Central Europe. I think what was July, the hottest July in the history of the world kind of stat. Like, I don't know, is it like not a great stat to not an MVP stat you kind of want for the world, but still. So clearly, you know, we're seeing so much evidence pointing to the fact that our climate is changing. Yet it's not leading the news bulletins every night, and it's not, to use your term, not shifting the needle. Why?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we had like a couple of days there in July where I think successive days were the hottest days ever, and you kind of step back from it and you think, God, this should be all that we're talking about, and yet we're not. And it's not because people aren't concerned. I mean, the stats show that there is a vast, the biggest segment of the Australian population is the one that's most concerned at around 35%. So, and if you put concern and alarm together, I think you get kind of closer to 62%. So it's not that people aren't, when they're asked, aren't concerned about it. It's just that next step in terms of taking action and actually engaging with it as well. And, you know, I mean, as an aside, I just saw the other day there's, you know, in Death Valley at the moment, it's kind of reaching temperatures of 55 degrees, and there's actually this weird climate apocalyptic tourism going on there where people are heading to Death Valley and getting selfies in front of the thermometer that says 55 degrees. And, you know, so people have really weird emotional responses to this kind of stuff. And there's all sorts of thinking and really good research around why people do respond to this in ways other than what you'd expect when it's possibly the demise of civilization kind of thing. So, you know, I think there's obviously at a higher level, there's, you know, I think there's something about our own mortality where people, you know, psychologists talk about mortality awareness and how we kind of avoid things that bring our own mortality right in our faces, which is, I guess, very understandable as well.
It's like me, I don't check my bank account when I get money out of the ATM.
Yeah. I'm the same. Yeah.
I don't want to know about it.
Yeah. So there is that dynamic as well, but there's also a whole lot of different, dynamics going on around identity, and, you know, there's a lot of people who, you know, it's not a big segment of the population in Australia. The kind of the denial, you know, segment is kind of 11 or 12%. So it's not huge. It's actually the biggest outside of America, which is interesting. But, I think partly the issue as well is, you know, that with the climate movement and a lot of people who are really with best intentions trying to shift things as well through facts and science. I think there has been over the years a tendency to just assume that the inherent, you know, unarguableness of the proposition will just do all the heavy lifting. So, you know, the world's heating up. You know, if we don't do stuff, we're all going to die. That should be enough to just like everyone for the penny to drop for everyone. And that's not how people work. You know, and also just an assumption as well that things will get, in terms of weather events and disasters, it'll reach a tipping point that we'll get to the point where that thing will happen, and then everyone will go, that's the point at which people go, and people thought that with the bushfires a couple of years ago, people thought that was going to be a real turning point. We saw it; it was in our faces. You know, people couldn't leave their homes because of the smoke in Sydney and, you know, other places. It was just so in your face and evident that surely people will, you know, en masse realise that this is something worth taking action on. And yeah, we know that a lot of people are actually really deeply invested in being avoidant about it, and the politicisation of it as well means that, you know, you can have the evidence right in your face, but if it doesn't conform your ideas about your own identity, then you're going to do everything you can to create a different reality, which says that this isn't the problem that people are saying it is. Yeah.
Unpack that identity thing. That's interesting.
Yeah.
If it doesn't conform to your identity, what do you mean by that?
Well, I'm talking about people strongly associate climate action with, a certain kind of person. It's now associated with kind of a progressive politics as well. So I actually think Al Gore has a lot to answer for in terms of, the inconvenient truth kind of stuff that happened in the noughties, which in and of itself was obviously really powerful, bit of communications, but it also really framed it as being a progressive cause. And I think, I reckon in the noughties you almost had you had a fork in the road where, I think even conservatives were starting to, sort of come round to it, because there's no inherent reason why climate should be, progressive or, like Hitler was an environmentalist, It's not just a given that it's a left cause. But I think now if you're a conservative, it just goes totally against your identity. If you're a free marketeer, a lot of people, see climate action as being anti-capitalist. When again, that's not inherently true. So there's a lot of interesting discussion going on at the moment about how do you reframe climate to appeal to different identities that maybe are not the usual suspects, and so how do you appeal to faith-based organisations and people, because you can very easily create messages that talk, and people are trying this at the moment with some success, to say things like God created this world, I'm a God-fearing person. This stuff that's going on is damaging that world, and equally with things like national security. Climate change has massive national security implications, but people don't talk about it that way, So there's going to be huge movement of people in and out of, across borders if this is as bad as we think it's going to be. And if you're a patriot, you don't want that. So the ability to frame these messages for these different audiences, simple as being a parent, why don't we talk more about climate to the level of clean air? Let's have more electric vehicles, because it's going to mean clearer air on our streets, and our kids are going to actually be breathing cleaner air, I think a lot of people in the climate movement would see that as being really reductive, but that actually is a powerful message if you care about the future of your kids, kind of thing. So how are we thinking about those in different ways, and not just through the prism of our own identity?
So you're touching on a bit there about, from a communication standpoint, what is not working. Can you dive into a bit deeper there? Where are they getting it wrong in terms of the? And I'm not framing this question as sort of shit on the environmental movement.
No.
Obviously, not doing that. But what are the challenges they're facing in terms of trying to communicate to these audiences that you're talking about?
Yeah, and so I think that's an important disclaimer. I've sort of have to be careful to not dishonour the huge amount of work that's gone on over the past couple of decades, where there's been really good people who have been very, with a lot of energy and earnestness, have been trying to, do good work in this space. And there's been a lot of good work that's done. But I still think there is a problem with the climate. With climate communications, progressive movements, and it's not just climate. You can see it in other places like the Voice as well. And not to go into that too much, but it's been described as the Enlightenment fallacy, where you think that the inherent goodness of the cause will do the heavy lifting as well. And I think you've seen that in the Voice, and you're seeing that here as well. Of course we need to act on climate, so people just need to get that. There's that kind of vibe to it. I think there's an issue around the fact that many people in this space, they're very comfortable with complexity. So they have conversations around complexity, and, they're happy to talk about UN Sustainable Development Goals and, all sorts of, frameworks and, donut economics and, all this kind of stuff that might speak to people who, are comfortable with this kind of complexity, but doesn't resonate with a whole lot of other different audiences as well. I think there's an issue with language. So even words like global warming, global warming is, I think is recognised now as being misleading because we're talking about extreme weather events, hot and cold and storms and bushfires. So warming is not great. Climate change, change is a very, is a very neutral word. So obviously, you've had climate crisis, climate emergency, it gives a bit more urgency to it as well. But I think at the heart of it is I think the climate movement has an antipathy towards marketing and simple messaging, right? And so a lot of the tenets of marketing are seen as being distasteful in the movement, are seen as being reductive, are seen as being trickery. And meanwhile, you've got the other side who are employing all of these tools, big companies, oil and gas, like the captains of industry who are all playing on that field, and the climate movement hasn't even gotten to the starting gate kind of thing. So I think there's a growing number of voices to say that climate movement has to get into the game on this stuff, and actually start using those tools, using simplicity, using repetition, using marketing to actually, win hearts and minds here as well. Yeah.
Do you remember the ad that was in the cinemas maybe who knows when it was, because the time has just become irrelevant to me, maybe a decade ago. It was an ad in a cinema by one of the major, like it was Santos or one of the major mining companies, and it's a woman. She's in her sort of, late 20s, short hair. I think it's implied she might be a lesbian. She's in the high vis and she's working in the oil industry, and it's just her background story. And just the messaging was like, it's personal narrative, it's story, and she's making, she's got great progress in her job and she's moving up in the world. Yeah. And that's why we're doing good work in this industry.
Yeah.
And I watched it like in Nova in Carlton, So everyone in there is all sort of like, and they're all just, tutting. And I went, that's a fucking good ad.
Yeah. Yeah. And you see that kind of, so they get it, but, where are those kind of personal stories on our side, And there's been, it goes back to this. I think it goes back to this idea of complexity, and you speak to people in the climate space, and the tendency is to go back to the science and to the facts and to the to the head stuff in this. And I'm not saying this is universal. Like there's a lot of people doing really good work in this space, but you've got to really bring your A game to this stuff, and you've got to use every tool that you've got. And I don't see that happening at the moment. Yeah.
You talked about language as well, and I've always felt like, I think I'm a progressive. I think I'm a progressive. I'm on the left, and I know sometimes when I'm communicating with people who are from the climate or environmental space that there's a disconnect between me and that person.
Yeah. And
they're kind of talking either down at me or over my head, or I feel like I'm in trouble when I'm having that conversation. And I just witnessed was it a year ago when they started to really elevate the climate emergency and trying to corner like Daniel Andrews to, will you admit that it's a climate emergency? And I'm just like going, whether he admits it or not, what difference is that going to make? And why are you yelling at him? Like, he's on the left.
Yeah.
Like, surely he's a part of this broader coalition. Like, you should be working with the levers of power to create change. So what do you think is the theory of change broadly? I know that there's environmentalism is a big community and there's a lot of sort of subsets and stuff. Yeah. But what is their theory of change?
What is the theory of change that you're describing, or what should it be?
What do you think theirs is right now? Because it's obviously not working. Because I think once you've got a theory of change, then you can work out how you want to communicate that and who to and who your audience is.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting thinking about what it has been and what it should be, because having seen the environment movement, this is 20 years ago, but I think in some ways, things haven't changed that much. The theory of change was, when it came to, native timber harvesting, for an example, is you stick your finger in the chest of the Labor government that is, inherently on side, like inherently for all the Greens kind of trying to diminish Labor's environmental credentials over the years, was Labor who saved the Franklin, It was a Labor government in Victoria that ended timber harvesting, west of the Hume. It is Labor that will end timber harvesting for the whole state next year, kind of thing. But the theory of change was, you just smash the government until they fold, and then you just move on to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And I think that, that ran out of steam, in the last decade, because I think Labor governments just got sick of that. So I think if you can switch over the proposition to climate now, I think there's a growing awareness amongst people campaigning, especially in the climate space, that the finger in the chest doesn't work anymore, and you've got to actually bring different parts of the public along with you. And so, if you look at all the different sort of segments of the population, from alarmed and concerned to disengaged and sort of dismissive denial types at the end, it's about, how do you actually shift people down that line towards being concerned? And there has been some success in that, but the idea that people will just naturally shift down that line as things get worse, that's just not true. We just know that for a fact. I mean, the research says that, for every 1 degree of warming, there is a 1 degree increase on its own of people who are identify as being alarmed or concerned. Now, that's not going to get us to where we want to get to, right? Yeah. So we need to actually be really actively targeting people, and also moving outside of these walled gardens that we sit in, and actually be trying to shift people who are not our people as well. Because the right are doing that. You can see that with The Voice. The right are actually grabbing people from all sorts of places, But I've sat in meetings with progressives, and I feel like I'm always the one who's saying, how do we reach those unreachable people? How do we get people, and I'm probably going to offend people by saying this, like, how do we get people in a pub in Narre Warren to give a fuck about this stuff? Yeah. Sorry, am I allowed to swear?
Oh, okay. Swear as much as like Ben.
If you walk into the pub in Narre Warren and you start talking about UN Sustainable Development Goals,
net zero targets.
Yeah, and in one of the times that I was mounting this argument, I had someone say to me, we shouldn't bother knocking on closed doors. That's not where our energy should be. And I'm like, closed doors is all that we should be knocking on, So I don't know how we got to this point where we don't want to be opening those doors, and we're actually just really comfortable sitting in cross-legged in amongst our own people and thinking that's going to change things at all, because that's not going to change things.
Let's take a quick break to talk about SwiftFox. Every moment on a campaign matters. You need the tools that you can trust. Lists that are up to date, absolutely. Phone banks that can change minds. Emails that drive donations, and events that will energise the community online and offline. And text blasts that distill your message perfectly. SwiftFox CRM is made for campaigners by campaigners. And to find out more, go to swiftfoxcrm.com to win your next campaign. Okay, let's get back to the show. Well, yeah, I mean, you just answered my next question, which was who is the audience that is seeking to, organise, quote unquote.
Yeah.
Because if their theory of change, I mean, all theory of changes in the end have to be centred on how do we use resources of some type of constituency to put pressure on those that are making decisions. And in this case, it's legislative change, basically. But it's also companies as well. They've got to change their habits too. So they are decision makers as well. I've found that, observing, I've seen that most of the resources that are being organised are people that are living, geographically speaking, in inner cities, right? In this sort of middle class elite group. A politician would be far more wary and worried about this issue if voters in marginal seats that make or break governments started to knock on their door and say, hey, we're concerned about this. And, correct me if I'm wrong, there are people out there that live in those suburbs. I'm sure there are small groups, or there are organisations and there are groups that are committed to addressing the issue of climate. But they are probably smaller numbers and they're not getting the support they probably need. A good example, a friend of mine's mother, actually, funnily enough, I don't know if she listens to the show or not, but she joined me up to the Labor Party. One of my best mates from primary school, high school, she was the president of the Warrigal branch of the Labor Party, and she just signed me up when I was 17. She left the Labor Party, like many did, in the sort of around refugees, and joined the Greens. And she lives in Pakenham. So that's your person out that way, right? She's just left the Greens because she's feel like she's sick of the infighting that's going on within their own political party, because she wants to do something about the environment. So there are people like that woman out there in those communities that want to do something, but they're not getting the support from all of the cashed up resources that exist in the big part of town, right, around here. And I wonder what this worries me, right? You're saying they don't want to go knock on those closed doors. Then what the fuck are they doing?
Yeah, well, I mean, and it's those people who I think, 63%, alarmed or concerned, I think that's a lot of people. And so that's people in the suburbs, that's people in country areas. And I mean, one of the weirdest things about all this is that, in terms of regional, Australians, that they are the closest to the impacts here. And yet a lot of them don't see themselves in this discussion, And when I was at Arena, we did a whole comms piece around dudes and women in hard hats and high-vis vests who were building solar farms in country areas, and didn't talk about climate at all, just talked about, jobs and economic opportunities. I said when I did the brief, I said, I want the renewable energy comms piece that Barnaby Joyce would like. And we actually almost got Barnaby Joyce to the opening of a wind farm. Like, I felt like I almost had him because, ironically, huge amounts of development going on in New England, in Armidale, massive economic opportunities in his backyard kind of thing. So, and I think federal Labor has done some work to kind of frame the hard hat, high vis story here a bit in terms of the economic opportunity of renewable energy, but there's still so much work to be done here, and there's so much low-hanging fruit in terms of how we can frame climate through all those different, identities that are beyond just the inner city kind of bubble. Yeah.
Do you remember I want to talk about the sort of this intersectionality and how the climate movement can build coalitions with unlikely partners. And I was just thinking, as you were talking before, about, remember the Lock the Gate campaign down in Marac, sort of out past Geelong for those outside of Victoria. Alison Marchant, who is now a member of Parliament for Labor in State Parliament, was one of the leaders of that campaign. And that was a coalition. So it was to end fracking, basically, in Victoria. And we have now the Andrews government, there's another initiative the Labor government's done, put a ban on fracking. But that campaign actually was, I think Alison is a school teacher by trade, but lives on a farm. And so she managed to, with a group of others, organise environmentalists down in that part of the world, the local communities, shop owners and farmers, because of the impact it would have had on the soil. So there was an economic and environmental argument being made here. This was going to ruin the livelihoods of a whole bunch of farmers. And I think it's interesting. I do wonder about, the farming community normally is represented poorly by the National Party, who are on the right side of politics, that this would be one group that actually would be saying, hey, we get this. Our livelihood depends on the environment. Because that's what we're living off. We're
Yeah.
literally living off the land, right? What other examples do you have of that, or what can you speak to in terms of examples where it's working, where we're seeing this intersectionality work as opposed to where it's not working?
Yeah, I was actually just up in the Northern Rivers over the past week, and there's some great work going on there with a mob called the Northern Rivers Living Lab, which was forged after the floods up there, and it's basically funded by state government, universities, but it's really taking the disaster of the floods and actually seeing how that can be an opportunity for people to come together, and all these different people from up there, because it's a very diverse community, and you've got farmers and you've got very progressive people, and you've got, townies and who are all trying to work out ways that they can recover and actually build resilience, because this is going to become more common all the time. And you have farmers sitting there with with hippies and other people and all sorts of different people who are actually coming together to talk about what kind of community do they want as well. And you've got irrigators up there. It's very flood prone marginal farming land. And the farmers have just, who, are not, have no sort of background in climate activism by any means, but have sort of banded together to, on their own, educate themselves about improving their farming practices, to put in place flood mitigation measures that build resilience. And they would never see themselves as being, climate activists. They're just trying to work out a problem. But I think, there is, when we went in there and talked to the people who are running that, there's a real spirit of everyone's welcome. And I think that's actually a really important piece in this as well, because I think often in progressive politics, as is the case with all sides of politics, I guess, not everyone is welcome, and to be able to sit with other people with really different viewpoints is really vital to this. And we heard a story about, we just listen to the people who are running this lab and talking about, there's going to be a need for some of that farming land to be for the land use to be changed there, and to actually protect the town, because the way that farm is happening actually increases the flood risk. But I think there's a tendency with the progressive side of things to just think that that's easy, and to think that, those farmers should just be able to just stop their sugarcane farm, and just revert it back to nature, and we just give them compensation and that's it, And these are people who've been farming those areas for generations, and it's not easy, and it requires empathy and listening and coming together and a real deep understanding about what that means culturally, economically, socially for those people as well. I think that if you do have that kind of empathy, it does allow you to work together for common solutions a lot better.
And we're seeing that problem as well, I guess, that it's going to come to a head, or is coming to a head right now, and continue to do so as coal companies divest in, like the Latrobe Valley, for example. We can see that Ongi and those companies are all pulling out of the valley. The Hunter, that's sort of, and I think it feels like Queensland's just one big bloody coal mine. These conversations are going to continue to happen, and either we're going to be, as to point at, pointing the finger in the chest of those workers, or we need to come to some kind of conversation where we can work together to overcome these challenges.
And not be simplistic about the solutions as well. Like if I had $1 for every time in the noughties that I had one of the environmental groups saying it was fine to shut down timber harvesting in the state because all those timber workers would just, automatically become tourism workers, or they'd start making craft furniture or whatever. Like that's actually not true. Like it's actually so much harder than that. And to create these really simplistic stories where you're just disregarding the deep cultural and social dislocation that comes from those changes is really just breeds that resentment and actually, you know, in a lot of ways, you know, makes change much harder. Yeah.
We're starting to stumble onto some areas of solutions, and you recently did some work with Oxfam, what I mentioned at the top of the program. Tell us a bit about that project and the things that you learned from that.
Yeah, so that was Oxfam Australia came to Fireside with a really particular challenge, and in some ways, I mean, we've been talking about the challenge of climate communication in this conversation. They were trying to deal with a subset of that, which is this whole sort of idea around, you know, climate justice. And climate justice is really about trying to ensure that the people who have had the least to do with creating this problem are not the ones that bear the disproportionate impact of what's going on. And that's in a, you know, you can see that bearing out in, the example would be, you know, the floods in Pakistan last year. You know, like Pakistan has contributed an absolute minuscule fraction of, you know, emissions to create this problem. And yet, because it's a poor country, when they had those massive floods, you know, it had, you know, just devastating impact that they're still feeling today. And, you know, things like, it's, you know, if your only asset is a cow and that's your kind of your superannuation, your you know, your food source, your everything, and you lose that cow, that's a big deal. So, you know, putting aside all the obvious kind of death and destruction that occurred there as well. So there's a lot of thinking going on about how you achieve climate justice. A lot of Oxfam's work is now about kind of fundraising and doing work in developing countries to promote that. Brings in sort of concepts like climate finance. So how do you actually provide loans to people in developing countries to build resilience? There's post disaster finance as well. So, you know, which is all designed to ensure that people aren't disproportionately affected. So Oxfam was going out there and talking about climate justice and just meeting a lot of confusion and, you know, head scratching about, well, why are you guys talking about climate? Aren't you guys the international development NGO? Like, we don't understand. And so they came to us and said, we need a story that actually properly frames this and properly explains why we're in the space, you know, and gets people to connect in with this idea of climate justice as well. So yeah, as I said, it's if we thought, you know, climate comms was hard, I mean, this is like another level. And so we did a lot of focus groups to kind of really gauge people's understanding of climate and climate justice as well. And that was really instructive, you know, and I always say to people, like, one of the best things you can do as a communicator is really sit in focus groups, because it just totally challenges all your perceptions about what people think, feel, what their level of knowledge is. You know, you can step outside yourself and see just how much of your judgment and decision making is based on just what you reckon. So
who were in the groups?
So it was divided into 4 groups. So it was divided across 8 by age. So I think it was under 35 and over 35. And then there was climate engaged, but not Oxfam supporters. And then there was Oxfam supporters, but not climate engaged. So really looking to see whether Oxfam's existing kind of people were going to be receptive to these messages, and then seeing whether they could actually grab people who weren't currently Oxfam supporters but were climate engaged to bring them across into the fold as well. And so, yeah, just really highlighted a couple of key issues that apply to this broader climate communications question as well. And one is that, people can say, even people who say they're climate engaged, especially the younger people, their understanding and knowledge of climate is a mile wide and an inch deep. Mm-hmm. So, so you had people who, were saw it purely as an environmental issue, which is not surprising. So if you start to talk about social, economic, class-based implications of climate change, people aren't even at the starting gate as well. The term climate justice, totally nobody except for maybe one or two people even came close to kind of understanding what that is. People, and again, this is the thing about terminology.
I don't know what it means.
Yeah. So you say, people thought it was about the legal system, courts of law, because of the word justice there. So that totally throws people. So one of the key bits of advice we gave to Oxfam is when you're talking about climate justice, don't say climate justice, just confuses people, And so, people didn't understand. You had to really, really lead people to that idea about that this isn't just environmental issue. This isn't just an energy issue. This is going to be a social issue. So there's so much work to be done in that space to actually take people to that point, So while we're still fighting these battles about getting people to engage in the overall, task and the fight, there's all these other bits of it that we're going to have to do heaps of work to get to. So, the task is massive. People really want, the other thing was really, which sounds a bit obvious, but was really strong. People want, because people feel so overwhelmed by the enormity of it, they want really clear, discrete actions that they can take to do something. Whether there's low barriers to entry. People talk about waste and recycling a lot, and that's because they can do something about that. You can put your recycling in, even though recycling and climate, there's connection, but it's not the main game. People really gravitate to things like that as well. So people just want to be able to do something, and I mean, there's obviously broader issues at the moment in Australia about cost of living and heaps of other pressures that people are under. And the vibe in the room a lot of the time was around, we've got so much to worry about at the moment, including the climate stuff. And now you're telling us about a whole nother thing that we hadn't even thought of, which is like climate justice and intersectionality of climate and all that kind of stuff. People are just like, they don't have the space to deal with that as well, which I think goes back to the point around, making it easy for people and really tailoring really simple messages and not overwhelming them with complexity and frameworks and, all these kind of things as well. The great news is that, or the positives was that people were really receptive to a story of us. So, and that was one of our key recommendations to Oxfam was like, if you can actually build bridges of experience and understanding between our experience and the experience of, a farmer in Pakistan, which is not an easy thing to do, but is doable, like that we're all in this together. One person in the focus group was talking about the experience with COVID, with vaccines, about how we sent all those vaccines over to Papua New Guinea and that we were all kind of dealing with the pandemic together and use that as an example. And so if you can frame people in other countries as not as the other, but, the climate problem is actually something that unites us all, then that has a really big, that shifts things a lot. People really, like we talk a lot about heroes and villains in our game. People really don't come at that when it comes to climate and climate justice. Yeah, because who is the villain, right? So I think you can talk about, corporations, oil and gas, that kind of thing being villains. But I reckon it's because actually when we're talking about heroes and villains in this space, the villains are us. Like we're all the villains in this as well. And
nobody wants to be the antagonist in that story.
No. So it actually, the hero villain framing takes us further away from that story of us as well. So yeah, I mean, I think we really, in our advice to Oxfam, really talked a lot about how you convert those findings into storytelling as well. And because they didn't have clear example stories about how climate impacts on people in Bangladesh, Pakistan, Pacific Islands, that kind of thing as well. So getting really kind of clear storytelling. Even their imagery was like not clear. So we asked for all of their climate imagery about how it impacts on people. And, you know, they'd show us a picture of like a woman standing waist deep in a river where it was really nondescript about, you know, who she was, what she was doing, what her circumstances were, that kind of thing. So it is a hard thing to depict in imagery, but if you can find imagery that really brings home the impact to people and tells a really clear story about how, you know, the worsening yearly cyclones in Bangladesh actually impacts on people's livelihoods and their way of living and that kind of thing as well, then that's going to make a huge difference. And I think, you know, like, again, a lot of people in the climate movement would see focus on pictures and imagery as being a little bit reductive and, you know, lacking the complexity of, you know, the problem. But you know, it's absolutely essential that you get that picture right. Another interesting insight was, and I could do a whole other podcast about this whole thing, that how poorly protest travels with people these days. Like someone needs to do a marketing campaign on protest, like especially the young people. Young people do not like protesting. Like,
I find that actually quite fascinating.
Yeah. Like we actually had the young people. They had a whole list of what are the things that you would do to engage on climate justice. Young people would rather, and this is a generalisation, but based on what I saw, young people would rather volunteer in a developing country than go to a protest.
Yeah, it's because they're Instagram bloody account. Or whatever the hell they're putting pictures up on these days.
Yeah. So I think maybe they had pictures of them, images in their mind of going to a Pacific island and getting good stuff on the Instagram. But I just think like I still wonder what is the problem people have with the idea of protest. Why is it seen so negatively at the moment? You know. When the barrier to doing that is obviously much lower than getting on a plane and going to another country. To
Kiribati or something.
Yeah.
Sound like absolute two Gen Xers here right now, shitty on the Zoomers or whatever they're called. Well, I find that interesting because I actually, coming from the other side, I'm also over the protests because it's mobilisation. It's a one-trick pony. It's a one-off.
Yeah.
You know, because I always ask, and then what? Like, great, you got 600 people to a rally, or you got 20,000. Now what are you going to do? Because everyone's going to leave here today and do nothing else. You know, this was just a great opportunity for people to listen to their own voices and go, wow, I gave a great speech, you know. But really, if it's like a massive kick-ass house meeting, then there has to be an ask. You know, what is that ask, and how does it fit within the strategy of building power to create the change you want? And I just think protests are one tactic that just gets done in isolation, and it ends up being a complete waste of time.
So you've never been a protest kind of guy?
It has its place, absolutely, but there's got to be an ask.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Not targeted enough.
Yeah. Like I thought about, remember the I mean, geez, you could do it for any of them really. Like the women's marches that happened a while back. I went to the one down in the Treasury Gardens opposite Parliament. That sort of beautiful Wednesday afternoon, and I ran into a whole bunch of former field organisers for the Labor Party.
Yeah.
And, they, God bless them, turned to me and said, Stephen, now what? Like, what's the ask next? What do they want us to do? All these great speeches, but they just sent us off on our way.
But don't you think you can embed that ask into the process?
Yeah, you can, but they're not doing that. That's the point.
Yeah.
They're just not doing it.
Yeah.
And so I'm kind of with the young kids. Fuck it.
Yeah.
I'm going to go to Papua New Guinea and, try and help some community build some schools that got impacted by some flood. I don't know, right?
Yeah.
So I can kind of see where they're going from. Maybe they're rocking up and going, this is a waste of time.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe that that need for action is like stronger than it was in the 60s. Yeah.
Well, also it's different now because in the 1960s and the 70s, we didn't have the internet. So where you have communal gatherings, they happened in these spaces, right?
Yeah.
Whereas now we can gather in so many other different ways.
Yeah, that's a really good point. You convinced me.
Like I said, I think they have its place, but it's not. It can sometimes just be the be all and end all. And when I work with organisations and we go through what are our tactics, multiples, not just the one that we're going to use over time, invariably they'll go, let's do a protest. Okay, great. How are we going to build for it, and what happens after it? I don't know. Well, okay, come on. What are we doing here? I want to get back to the story stuff because I find that interesting as well, okay? Mm-hmm. And you were fortunate enough to also study under Marshall Ganson. Obviously, we do name check Marshall a lot on the show.
Yep.
And he's credited with coming up with the public narrative framework, story of self, story of us, story of now. And you just mentioned before about the story of us. The story of now talks about combining both the head, that is the how do we get from A to B, with the heart, why we must get from A to B. And you need to engage both the head and the heart in order to engage the hands. And the hands represent action. Yep. Speaking of action. I should have tested you actually there, Ben, to see if you remember.
I do.
So I think to your thesis, the environmental movement are great with the how to get from A to B.
Yeah.
The strategy, the head component, but not the heart component.
Yeah.
And in the story of now, we need to create urgency in order for us to act. And I find it interesting when I was a teaching fellow this year for the Leadership Organising Action class, and there were some environmental students in my section this year. Mm-hmm. And when we got to the public narrative and story of now, it was interesting to watch them try, and they were very good at talking about how we must act, but not why we must act. Mm. And it was very much, the facts and the figures, but not saying, the narrative, the emotive side of our brain of why we must act. Why is that, do you think, amongst the environmental movement, that they struggle with that?
Well, I mean, I think it's, as I said before, it's like there's a comfort with complexity, and there's like that is a space that I think people who are interested in, this area and those kind of people who would have been going to that class would have been, exactly the kind of people who love sitting in complexity and love frameworks, and that's why they gravitate towards the head stuff. And also, the facts are bloody compelling. Like, the facts are unarguable. You have IPCC consensus about, just how disastrous the state we're in. So, and then when you have the heart stuff, it's almost like a sense that, again, that the heart stuff is self-evident as well, because it's like, it's all there, like it's all around us, but people don't see it that way. So, I think, I just don't think they're heart kind of people inherently. I mean, that's a really big generalisation. But yeah, if you've devoted yourself to science, especially as well, like that you're going to be much more sort of geared towards the facts and the head stuff.
Yeah.
And also I think, it's the idea as well that storytelling and marketing is like a bit of a trick, I heard someone on a podcast say the other day that what we need, and it's funny because it relates to the announcement, the very timely announcement that the Andrews government has made around banning gas in homes in Victoria, someone on a podcast was like, we need to run an ultra negative campaign about gas in homes, like how bad it is, how bad it is, the fine particulates that it puts into the air that our kids breathe in, like just throw everything at it, right? And the amount of shit that this person copped because people saw that as being trickery, like a campaign like that, because everything has to be evidence-based, like peer-reviewed, all that kind of stuff, which is fine, except, again, you're fighting on a battlefield that's totally different from where the main game is, and you're trying to combat messages with people who are prepared to throw everything at it as well. So, I don't think there's anything morally, ethically wrong with it, as long as you're, on the right side of the truth with employing those tactics, because it's a really important task.
But I mean, public narrative isn't trickery. Public narrative isn't marketing, though, is it? Like it's.
But those people that you're describing, I think they think it is.
That's bizarre.
Yeah.
We had one of the classes. I had to model the 4 C's. Some of the organisers out there will be nerding off what I'm talking about right now. But how to move someone from inaction to action through this framework that we teach in organising called the 4 C's. And I modelled it with one of the students who actually is from Tokyo. She's an environmentalist campaigner. And I thought, I had to create a scenario. And I was like, fuck it, and I didn't make this shit up. This is true. This story. And I said I needed to show how to incorporate story into an ask and a story of now. And we were role-playing this. I was doing a phone call, trying to recruit this student to an event in Tokyo. And I just sort of said to her, look, hi, no, my name's Stephen, call on behalf of the Tokyo Climate Action Group. How are you today, blah, blah, blah. You signed a petition last week in Tokyo, in Shibuya or wherever, about saving the sakura, the cherry blossom trees. Why did you do that? She said, it's really important to me, blah, 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 blah. And then I said, and this is actually a true story, I said, my first memory of the cherry blossoms was when I came over to Japan to visit my sister, and I happened to arrive the week that the cherry blossoms bloomed. And I remember sitting in a graveyard in Tokyo. That's because of where a lot of the cherry blossoms are, which is a tradition. And people during the day put out their picnic baskets, and they have a sandwich and a beer, and they sit underneath all the cherry blossoms. It's a Japanese tradition. And I remember sitting there going, and I was like 21, 22, and I was going, this is amazing. Like, this is a beautiful, beautiful experience. And what an introduction to this lovely country. And then I asked her, what's your first memory of the cherry blossom? And she told me this beautiful, beautiful story about what it means to her and her family. And I said, did you know that because of global warming, that the cherry blossom season is moving? It used to always be sort of roughly around late March, early April. It's getting earlier and earlier and earlier, and it's lasting for a shorter and shorter amount of time. And eventually there will be no cherry blossom season, or the cherry blossoms will not bloom. How does that make you feel? And she said, well, that sounds devastating. That's how you bring narrative.
Yeah.
And I just made that up on the spot. Like I didn't, I'm not an expert in this sort of shit, and I'm nor am I an environmentalist, but it took me 5 minutes to think about a story that means something to me.
Yeah.
And then creating this urgency of opportunity. If we don't do something about it, then this is going to go. How does that make you feel? And she said, okay, right, well, what do I want to do? Hey, guess what? We've got this meeting next week. We're asking a whole bunch of people around the community. They're also very fired up about this, to come together and work out how do we strategize to create change, blah, 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 blah. Can I count on you to be there? Yes, I will be there. Fantastic.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, why are we not? It's not that hard, Ben.
Yeah. I mean, it's so funny that you talk about flowers blooming, because I have a regular spot on ABC radio. We'll talk about communications, and we're just talking about some of this stuff this morning. And a talkback caller, talkback messenger messaged in talking about Jasmine and how every year Jasmine flowered around the time of her uni exams.
Yes.
Yeah. And
sorry, I don't want to get excited by that, but it's true, because there's a massive jasmine plant out of my window when I was at Glen College.
And she associates Jasmine with uni exams, and she's noticed that every year the jasmine is flowering earlier and earlier, and right at like
I smelt it the other day.
yeah, it's now, right? And that was really unsettling for her. And so like these kind of personal stories and experiences are exactly the kind of things that we should be tapping into.
Yeah.
But I just don't think we're even kind of at the starting gate of this stuff yet.
Wow.
But I think you're right. It's so obvious to me, you know, yeah, the power of personal experience in all of this as well. And you can apply that to, I'm sure there's like stories around fishing and, you know, like all sorts of stuff, which is directly going to people's personal experience. Like that's just, yeah.
I do wonder, this thought struck me during COVID, during one of the many lockdowns that Dictator Dan forced us all through. I obviously live and work in the CBD, and I was walking down Collins Street to get a coffee on my within 500 metres of my home on my designated day. I could go for a walk. And the street is dead, right? It's like I Am Legend in the middle of the city during that second lockdown. It was surreal. But I had this moment of clarity where I went, shit, if you'd said to me that one day government just told us you're going to stay home, and we all did that, I'd say, I don't know that it's possible, but it was possible. We acted, right? And we all acted together. Now, by the end, it was starting to fall a bit apart. I know people having little sneaky parties in each other's homes, you know, by the 30th lockdown or whatever. But, you know, certainly for a long period of time, we saw the community able to work together for a greater cause. Why could we do that for COVID, but we can't do that for...
Well, I mean, I think that's the great hope, right? So even... I mean, there's a book called The Uninhabitable Earth where the first line is, it's worse, much worse than you think. And then it just sets out just how bad this could all get in terms of, you know, sea level rise and global destruction, all that kind of stuff. But even the author is, whose name escapes me for the second, is essentially optimistic and about the future. And because if the truth is, if we've managed to, in just a couple of centuries, radically alter the atmosphere with our technology, we have the means and the wherewithal to change it back. Like that's just logical. So we can do it, but we just have to have the will to do it. So for me, there's hope in that, and that actually is energized. Even when I say those words, I can almost feel like that. That stress and tension around climate like lift, you know. And so I think, yes, there's a place for, you know, Antonio Guterres style, you know, messaging around, you know, the year of global boiling has commenced. But we have to combine it with those messages of hope. Otherwise, you know, it's just a recipe for further kind of alienation and avoidance. But yeah, I mean, I think there did feel like there was a lot of hope in COVID around our ability to just like creating vaccines in a couple of months, like amazing, you know. And you can frame that as a negative if you relate it to climate and say, well, isn't it terrible that we can't apply that to climate? But we can. We just have to decide to. And I think if you can mobilise enough people to feel that hope and to feel like they have actually some agency and some ability to change things, then that's the way to shift people.
I'm glad that we ended it on a high note there, Ben. That was good. Well done.
Thank you.
Always want to end on hope.
Always end on hope.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But before you do go, anything you want to plug?
At Fireside, we run a digital magazine called The Story. So thestory.au, which is all about the art and science of storytelling. We do have a bit of a focus on climate communication that we come back to a lot. And so it's really, we have a feeling at Fireside that the whole discourse around storytelling is possibly sometimes used by communications agencies as kind of bullshit, just to do what they've always done, just like dress it up in storytelling. And we really feel that we want to be different to that, and we actually have a deep interest in not just selling ourselves as storytellers, but having deeper discussions about storytelling. And so that's a place that we do that. We have really excellent writers who we commission to do great stories about not just climate, but a whole lot of other aspects of story. And yeah, we're really proud of it. So check it out.
It's a great publication. We'll put the link to it in the notes for today's episode. I have one thing to plug as well, actually, and my producer Rebecca will be angry at me if I don't do this. The ALP National Conference is coming up in a week or so. I'm not actually sure when we're publishing this particular episode, so this is I'm getting called out here in the land of podcasting and planning. But the National Conference is on from Wednesday the 16th of August to Saturday the 19th of August. No, I tell a lie. It's on from Thursday the 17th of August to Saturday the 19th of August. Socially Democratic is doing 2 shows for the Fringe. So the Fringe, ALP Fringe is sort of a side event in which anyone can go. You can buy tickets, and I'll put links to how you can purchase tickets for the Fringe on the show notes as well. There's a whole bunch of there's like a market stall, and there's a whole bunch of different workshops and sessions run by different groups within the party and outside the party and the broader movement. Socially Democratic is doing 2 podcasts for the Fringe. One on the Thursday afternoon at 3:30, which is on unionism, and it's with Michelle O'Neill from the ACTU, Michael Caine from the TWU, and Melissa Donnelly from the CPSU, no relation. And on the Friday, Social Democratic is doing another show, also at 3:30, and it's on modern campaigning, and we're being joined by Kate Flanders, who's the Queensland branch secretary of the ALP, Eloise Young, who used to be the digital director for Premier Dan Andrews, and Nadia Montague, who is the national training director for the ALP National Secretariat. So those 3 very experienced campaigners will be talking about campaigns. Last thing to plug is on the Saturday at 10 a.m, I'm leading a workshop on, it's almost like an orientation to community organising, but we're using a test case, which was a campaign that Dunn Street ran over 2 years, in which we organised a group of community members within the Hawthorn Football Club that wanted to knock off Jeff Kennett and their leadership to turn their club into a far more open and democratic club, and we won. Anyway, so
there's a story about it on the story if you want to check it out.
That is true. That's right. And so we ran this campaign and were successful. So I'm going to use that as a test case to show the 6 practices of community organising as taught by Marshall Gantz at the Harvard Kennedy School. So that's at 10 a.m. on the Saturday the 19th. Those dates and everything will be up on our on the show notes. But to get tickets to the Fringe, if you are in Brisbane for the ALP National Conference, the links will be in our show notes for today. Okay, enough from me. Ben Hart, thank you so much for coming on the show today. It's been fantastic. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, I loved it. Yeah.
And we wish you the best of luck with both Fireside and also the story.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to Socially Democratic. Did you like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcast or Podchaser. And to get all the latest on Socially Democratic, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And we'll see you next Friday. Socially Democratic was brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. Maurice Blackburn Lawyers have spent more than a century paving the hard path to justice for everyday Australians. They've helped over 500,000 Australians turn their situation around, and they know how the system works. Their experience and skills means you'll get the best results possible. Find out more on their website, mauriceblackburn.com.au. Maurice Blackburn, experience you can count on. Socially Democratic was brought to you by SwiftFox. Every moment on a campaign matters. You need the tools that you can trust, lists that are up to date, phone banks that can change minds, emails that drive donations, events that will energise the community online and offline, and text blasts that distill your message perfectly. SwiftFox CRM is made for campaigners by campaigners. To find out more, go to swiftfoxcrm.com to win your next campaign.